Today is focused on the features of narrative structure and dynamics. So we just want to understand here today what we can about narrative, how it's composed, and the way it works. We are these homo neurons. We tell stories. That's who we are as human beings. These stories get adopted. We tell stories inside of frameworks that already make sense to people. So they're easy to adopt. They're easy to fold into the catch of stories we already have. Now, the problem here is not just that these stories are adopted, but that then the stories start to tell us. In other words, we end up being the perspective that that narrative offers. Who's in charge? I would more likely say the narrative than the people. The basis of narrative is really social constructionism, where you have folks, here's two people in this little diagram, and they are, interacting with each other, and they're negotiating their meanings, right? And they're doing that in context of language and perception and their actions, right? So they're building on their prior social experience, and they're coming together to create meaning. So this is intended to anchor the idea that meaning is not something circulating in the head. It's in this between space in the interaction. That's where it lives, in a web of meaning that is derived and developed through interaction. Now, there's another important phenomena here, and that is the observer. You get a narrative system, which is folks paying attention to how other folks are making sense. So the I is really you, us observers, and we're looking at how other people are making sense in this social construction process. And keep in mind, the narrative system is this combination of people making sense, but us observing. And so we're going to bring our stories to that sense making. The next point I wanted to make is really about what is a narrative. And it's got three core component parts internal to it. There are values, which are just the moral frameworks that people are using to make sense of things. There's a plot, and the plot is the sequence of events. First this happened, then that happened, then this happened, and that led to this terrible thing that happened. That's an outcome. And so it has a beginning and a middle and an end, that plot. And then it has character roles, people, and people are doing things. The values and the plot are in service to characters. They inform us. They anchor the way in which we're describing the role of the people and what they're doing and who they are. So we can see that of these three components, the most important one that's critical to us in trying to promote conflict resolution or trying to support negotiation is the social construction of the character. That's the most important thing, because conflict is generated when characters are positioned negatively. So when the plot and the value systems function to negatively position people, you're going to get conflict all the time. Conversely, if the plot or the values support the legitimacy and anchor the legitimacy of that character, you will have the development of trust, the increase of connection, possibility of collaboration, etc. You do not want to, in any kind of conflict resolution framing or effort, you don't want to negatively position people. Plots and characters and moral values, components of the internal structure of narrative, operate in tandem with each other to create an internal system that it has closure. It closes itself off to alternatives. So that's a really important and very bad, let's say, feature of narratives that you have to understand. Otherwise, you think they're capable of change, but they have an internal coherence that generates something called narrative closure. They fit together. Let me just use the United States. Basically, the story on the left is government should be protecting people and providing a safety net. And the story on the right is that government is dangerous. We want less government. We don't want him to take our money. Each of these has its own internal coherence. The good news is that because all of these are intricately connected, these three parts, all you have to do is change the plot line and the values and the characters change. All you have to do is change the characters and the plot and the values change. All you have to do is change the values and etc. So you make any changes to any three of these components, and you're going to have some slight evolution in the narrative. if it holds, it's got to hold. It's got to be elaborated. It's got to be picked up and elaborated. But if it's picked up and elaborated, it will make a difference. Just one quick story and then I'll go on. So I was interviewing one woman, very, very right-wing woman. I talked to her for about an hour in a curious and respectful way. So I never delegitimized her. I never positioned her negatively. And I even made some positive comments like, wow, you seem to be able to talk to all different kinds of people. Where'd you learn how to do that? And she told me, and we talked further about that. And she told me at the end of the conversation, I've never had a conversation with the person on the left. So all that was that one question. It was a general tone of respect, but basically that one question on my part of how did you learn to be respectful? And that framing of her as that way changed everything. These are just some principles of narrative that I wanted you to pay attention to. I want to also talk to you about narrative genre. Stories are told in all kinds of different genres. Most of them are told in a melodramatic form. What does that mean? There's a villain, who has a long mustache. There's a villain. There's a poor damsel in distress. There's some kind of hero in the background trying to take care of things. There's usually a father figure there. And that's very different than a tragic narrative. You see this image here. Oedipus is putting out not somebody else's eye, his own eye. Why? Because he gets it, that he contributed to the nature of the problem. He tried to escape his fate of sleeping with his mother and killing his father. And he did the very things that the oracle predicted. He participated in the outcome. And once he knows that, that's a tragedy. And all of us in the audience watching the play or reading the play are thinking, oh my God, how terrible. Why? Because we know in our own lives, we have done in many of the conflicts or problems we have in our own personal lives and at the national level, we've participated in the production of the problem. The tragic narrative is one that's going to be more generative of agency. People are going to be able to do something about their situation because they've recognized the role that they're playing in the producing of it. So it's a conflict reducing rather than conflict productive genre. So we're still talking about typologies of narratives. These are stock stories that really tell us what to do. This is a picture in the United States in about 1954 was the legal case in the country that desegregated the schools and allowed students of color to go to white schools. And this is a picture more or less from then of people protesting that decision. And you see the signs, stop the race mixing, right? Well, those narratives instructed people to get out there on the street and protest because they had adopted these racist narratives. They'd lived with them. These narratives had instructed them what to do. Once these stories get set up, they end up policing us. So there are things that we can't do because of the stories they're telling. They provide the logic for actions. They create our networks, our friends, the groups we belong to. And they basically also provide these narratives, the architecture for our institutions too. They shape our courts, they shape our legislatures, they shape our social processes and how we navigate. They're incredibly powerful. But let's think about what counts as a master narrative. So there's foundational stories or foundational myths, fairy tales, religious stories of Cain and Abel, for instance. You can have landmark court cases like Roe versus Wade in the United States that legalized abortion. You can have important movies, etc. So those are some components. Those are some features of narrative. Now I want to talk a little bit about how they work, the dynamics of them. They position people. They construct the positions that people are in, and the divisions between them. The divisions based on these moral frameworks, but the divisions are also a function of the way in which they are cast as either negative or positive, the characters. It's how history gets constructed and memory gets performed, and the social construction of the norms itself that end up producing contexts where there are these divisions between people. This social positioning is a routine, regular feature of narrative and very, very problematic when it comes to the production of conflict. And there's some real damaging master narratives that we have to try to keep our eyes on. They end up justifying many narratives, damaging ones, justify the oppression of a less powerful group that positions, there's a character in red, as morally subnormal or delegitimate. It can even poison people's self-concept, right? And their beliefs about who they are. So if there's a master narrative that is the fatalist narrative, maybe that has poisoned people's conception of who they are by framing their experience to themselves as they're unable to make a difference, as they're unable to make change. These master stories, they crowd out or distort alternatives, right? So we can't really see other ways of being, and they diminish access to resources. So these master narratives are very pernicious, dangerous, damaging, etc. These fractures, that things that happen from master narratives, the way they separate us, divide us, all that appears in our social networks, where you see divisions in our social world. The blue people only talk to other blue people, and the red people only talk to other red people. And they don't live in the same place, and they don't interact with each other. And that's what we've got right now, extreme polarization in the United States, where we don't even have any connections to each other anymore, and we can't work together. This happens through the repeated tellings. These master narratives happen. They create this sort of powerful eddy, this powerful flow that actually simplifies and rigidifies the narratives themselves as they're told. So not only do these master narratives exist, but the more they're told, the more rigid and simplified they get, which is problematic for us. This is the picture of George Floyd's death, when the officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes till he died. It changed the United States when this happened. Counter narratives would be any narrative that destabilizes a master narrative. And this is the good example of the way in which the more racist narrative about we all have equal opportunity, and the blacks shouldn't get extra treatment, and blacks are by nature dangerous and criminal, that all was upended with this thing. And you destabilize the master narrative in a couple of ways. You can alter the plot by generating what's called a unique outcome. And a unique outcome is anything that goes against the generalization that the narrative is making. You can introduce new characters in the story, or you can introduce new values. This goes back to the theory of change here. So these counter narratives can be developed by the inclusion of these new things, but they have to be elaborated. You can't just, announce it one day. You have to have a program for elaboration. The narrative system as a whole also has closure, not just the internal structure. This is a picture of a gravitational field where you've got a big story, right? That's the Earth. I'm just using this as a metaphor here. And it's the big story. The master narrative is, heavy. It's creating sort of a bending of the space-time continuum there. And counter narratives are kind of on the edge. They're sort of in relation to the master narrative, but they're much punier. There's fewer people elaborate them, and they are not as effective. The problem is that as a narrative system, what happens is that the master narrative knows the counter narratives are there, has already responded to them for the most part. The counter narrative is defeated, let's say, because the master narrative just incorporates it and knows how to respond. So when you're in a counter narrative, master narrative dynamic, when you see a master narrative that just doesn't even bother with it anymore. I want to elaborate the system from the tree perspective. And if we think about this, a master narrative as having the trunk, which is basically what it is, and then a set of roots, which are these mythic narratives that support it, and then a set of policies or practices that materialize from it as the branches. This is just a metaphor to help us understand what this master narrative looks like and how it operates. You have, in a polarized context, you don't have a whole ton of these. We've got in the IFIT paper clarity that in a polarized landscape, you've got a couple of these. In highly polarized situation like we've got in the US right now, you may have a few more of these big master narratives that are regulating and organizing and structuring everything, but they're often in a polarized setting, just, they sort of can be condensed into a couple of them anyway. In terms of the dynamics of these processes, you get these people in victim Olympics, right? Everybody's trying to be the biggest, the worst victim by the mean other, the mean Goliath. You have victim narratives, and they're generating these defensive counter accusations, or people are trying to help them. You get these what's called a strange loop, which is where interactions actually increase the escalation, and you end up, people stop talking, then you have silence, and then you have violence. And that's the inevitable sequence, right? is this accusation, counter accusation. That doesn't work. Then people stop talking and then there's violence. But everybody's struggling basically to have their narrative elaborated. That's what they want, is to have their narrative elaborated. Why do they want their narrative elaborated? Because in the narrative that I will elaborate, me and my group are legitimate. So this is a struggle for legitimacy, which should be a big clue to all of us working in conflict resolution, that our job is to support the evolution of narratives which enable people to show up as legitimate, maybe not perfect, but as legitimate. These violent stories where people are delegitimized, they break relationships. Delegitimization ends up generating the circumstances where the master narrative, the counter narratives, can't be heard. Elaine Scarry wrote a book, The Body in Pain. It's a classic. She says in there that what violence does is organize and structure how we talk about pain, limits it, and polices it, right? There's all the different ways in which we could describe what's happened to us get limited by the constraints on how we talk about weapons and wounds. There's been really incredible research on the Holocaust testimonies that show very extreme violence actually disrupts the capacity to tell stories. People can't even figure out what happened. They can't put the events together. They can't organize themselves. You can look at some of these Holocaust testimonies and a victim will say things like, I was at the train station and the sun was very red. And I remember the red sun. And that's how and then I don't know. And that's exactly what she said. So you see, this doesn't even sound like a narrative. She can't even, sort of tell the story. So it destroys narrative itself when violence gets extreme. And it basically damages identity, right? This is a very good book written by Hilda Nelson. Basically, this delegitimization damages people's sense of themselves, damages their resources and opportunities. It creates these circumstances where narratives are actually maintaining themselves through this own coherence. These master narratives continue to be damaging, and then they are working to consume these counter narratives that could show up. And basically, folks, both the tellers and the tellees, the people who are telling or speaking the story and the people who are spoken about, end up locked. They end up locked into these prisons, into these narratives that they can't get out of. When you see what we're up against from a narrative lens, when we think about conflict, we have a lot working against us, I would say, to think about how to undo this difficult thing. Here's the theory of change, basically. You've got very simplistic stories that have been told over and over that have got this internal coherence, and they get simpler over time. They're enormously stable, and they anchor the legitimacy for some people, and they anchor delegitimacy for others. Solution, in a nutshell, is to go back and introduce some new features, either a new plot line or events on a plot line, either new values, or some ones that are slightly articulated or associated to the ones they're offering, or new characters, or characters differently described. The solution is also to elaborate in some way even partial positive positions for people. And I do that with everybody I'm interviewing, because people don't want to talk to anybody that's going to delegitimize them. So no matter the conversation, whether it's a personal conversation, whether I'm in a policy forum, I'm still organizing to position that person as legitimate in some way. So I want you to think of Oedipus stabbing out his eye. People need to take responsibility for what they've done. And that responsibility has to include elaborating a narrative where they have been less than perfect. That's the strategy then, is to have complexity in terms of the constructions of the characters. And here's a theory of change. If you alter any narrative components of those three, plot, characters, and moral values, the whole narrative will change. If you elaborate the positive intentions, not just the positive traits, the door opens when you elaborate other people in positive ways. And if you elaborate other people's narratives, these narratives get more complex. So imagine dialogues whose main point is not just to hear the story, but to support its evolution or development. Narrative complexity decreases conflict and opens up options for new policies and strategies and practices. The direction we're going in is towards better formed stories that have more complex characters, They've got more moral values that are not just binary. You're either like this or you're like that, but you can also be these other three things. And that has implications for their new binaries. They're gray instead of black and white, let's say, and more circular plots. And a circular plot is like Oedipus. He did these things and that things. These other people did this stuff, and then he did these things, and then they did that, and then he did this. And all together, they made that story. Very different than the story that those people over there are bad and I'm good. And then these things happen because they were bad, and that led to this bad outcome. This circular narrative is really about how everybody played a role in the production of the problem and the production of the conflict. So that's where we want to go. The reason why that's so important is because without it, we're alone. We're socially isolated. We're set apart, like that red character in the slide. We won't survive without each other. So the main point of what we're doing all the time in our lives, all of us, all over the planet, is telling stories that position us as legitimate. So I do think that is cross-cultural, across time, across all people. I think it's generic to human beings.